Legend has it that he was born during a raging thunderstorm in 1877. A prophetic beginning for the fury and violence that would dominate the life of Pancho Villa. Bloodshed, buried treasure, and political betrayal on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border all play a role in what we know about him. But for years, experts have disagreed about whether Pancho Villa was a decorated national hero or a merciless outlaw. The truth falls somewhere between the facts and folklore that have surrounded him for almost a century.
Who was Pancho Villa? In terms of the revolution, I think it was the strongest revolutionary in Mexico.
He would take anything he wanted, any food, any women, or whatever he wanted, and that he was a very ruthless man.
Pues para mí, y para muchas gentes.
For me, and for many people, he was a military genius, a great leader. Not just with a gun or a machete, but with his mind.
My opinion is that he was an evil person. He was very violent. He was very cruel. He was not a hero. He was an assassin.
Y era un hombre muy carismático. Era un hombre que era capaz.
He was a very charismatic man and would help the people who needed him. That's where the legend of the Mexican Robin Hood comes from.
He's been immortalized in folk songs and murals, glorified in public monuments, but also scorned by many with memories of atrocities.
He grabbed the baby by the feet and slammed the baby head first onto the street. Thereafter, he killed every member of her family.
He would cut off the soles of people's feet and drag them behind horses. He would go in and he would kill children when he felt that they were part of the landed aristocracy. And he would do things that were to us, as you know, in a civilized society, just disgusting.
But I can say that it was a war. You cannot stop doing brutal things in a war.
He was a Robin Hood. He robbed from the rich, he gave to the poor. He killed the poor, he killed the rich. He stole from the rich, he stole from the poor.
¡Que viva mi general Francisco Villa!
History books know him as Francisco Villa, but he was born Doroteo Arango.
He came from a poor family in the state of Durango. He was born in San Juan del Rio.
Like millions of impoverished Mexican peasants, Doroteo seemed destined to a life of backbreaking labor under hopeless debt to a rich hacienda owner.
The poor people in this country became poorer, you see, and the rich people became richer.
It was a system where the common man had no vote, no say whatsoever in the type of government that was looking after his interest, or supposedly looking after his interest.
In the late 1800s, Mexico was ruled by the tyrannical regime of President Porfirio Diaz, who held power for almost 30 years. It was a time of tumultuous unrest in a struggling nation whose history was already drenched in the blood of freedom fighters. A young peasant boy with a quick temper was about to emerge as a key figure in a decade of devastating civil war that would change the history of North America forever. At the age of 12, while working on a hacienda, Doroteo killed an aristocrat who had raped his sister.
Por esta historia de su hermana,
the story we have is that his sister was assaulted by the owner of the hacienda.
Y Villa, en un arranque de
And Villa, in a rage of anger, in order to defend his sister, shoots the hacendero.
Y entonces surge la proscripción.
This is a story Villa himself used to tell.
He was instantly a fugitive with a price on his head, living in the wilds by stealing cattle.
Sus dorados nadie quiere recordar.
Folk tales say by the time he was 20, the young outlaw had used a knife to kill a policeman who tried to arrest him. And while he was a fugitive, one step ahead of the law, he decided to change his name.
His real name was Doroteo Aranga. And where the Pancho Villa comes from, most people still argue. Some say that it came from an uncle, some say it came from a grandfather, some say it came from a friend who was slain.
With a new name, Villa even tried honest work.
He did his best, to be honest, and to live within the civil codes. There's a story of him in a mine and working in the mines, which there are many in northern Mexico, and he got injured.
His foot was crushed in an accident, and he had to sell his horse and rifle in order to see a doctor. Villa tried to start his own business, but a meat market he opened failed. Pancho Villa returned to the hills of northern Mexico to do what he was good at. Stealing cattle and leading gangs of bandits. In 1910, the young outlaw met Francisco Madero, a political idealist with revolutionary ideas. Madero gave voice to the common people's outcry for freedom. Pancho Villa joined the uprisings and was now fighting for a cause. He was either feared or admired, depending on what end of his pistol you happened to find yourself looking at. Some personal notes. Pancho Villa did not smoke or drink alcohol. He did believe in marriage. And how? He was married in church ceremonies dozens of times.
Yes, it's true there were many women in the life of Villa. The ones I've learned about through my study are the ones with whom he had children. We are a large family, but we all know each other.
Villa's first official order in Madero's revolutionary army was to hunt down and kill a local judge friendly to the federal government. Villa proved to be a good rebel and was soon promoted to the rank of colonel.
I think that he felt he had to kill in order, that the ends justified the means of the revolution. Pancho Villa carried out a lot of atrocities, but ultimately his goals and his principles he adhered to throughout most of his life. He was a person who believed in that poor people had a role in the civil society, and more than just being slaves, but as being a part of the process and an equal part of the process of a civil society.
In his lifetime, he was known by many names, perhaps the most fitting, El Alacrán, the scorpion, because like that tiny predator native to the Mexican desert, Pancho Villa would prove to be mysterious, elusive, and most of all, deadly. In 1910, Mexico went to war against itself. Rebels took up arms throughout the country, attacking the Federal Army.
And they would wipe out thousands and thousands of people in one battle, and it was vicious. But Pancho Villa always lived through all of these battles, and yet he fought right in the middle of all of them. It's you know, part of his legend is that he was not only brave but blessed in some way.
One of the bloodiest civil wars in history lasted an entire decade, devastating Mexico's economy. Pancho Villa would be one of the only major revolutionary generals to survive the 10 years of fighting.
Villa's tactics were charge, and his army, he called them the Dorados, the golden ones, and they simply, like a vast sheet of fighting men, they just simply overran and overwhelmed and just crushed everything that lay in front of them.
As a general, he went into battle at the head of his troops.
Life for a Mexican revolutionary was hard. Armies were often makeshift bands recruited on the run. Rebels would sometimes have to cross hundreds of miles of rough terrain just to get to the next battle.
These troops were really nomadic troops. Villa would recruit these people from villages, and once they left their villages, who knows what happened to those villages. A lot of times other armies would go in and they would occupy them, so people really had nothing but the land and their horse, and so to sustain themselves, and this is a reason for a lot of the pillaging, was that they would have to go in and get water and food and supplies and resources and women and, you know, all the things that soldiers need to sustain themselves throughout this period of battle.
The stealing of cattle, the looting, was a normal and acceptable part of battle. The killing of people is also a part of battle. Depending on where you stand, where your viewpoint comes from, would put Pancho Villa on either in your good list or in your bad list.
In the early 1900s, while Mexico anguished in the throes of revolution, the United States, in drastic contrast, was emerging as a global industrial power, which meant prosperity and tranquility for most Americans. Meanwhile, in Mexico, there were few jobs not connected to the huge haciendas or the military call to arms. Americans could read the daily newspaper accounts of the turmoil in nearby Mexico while enjoying the relative affluence of their own lives. In 1911, in the United States, you could buy a new wool-tailored men's suit for $18. The latest fashion Sunday hat for $5, a lady's corset for $1, a pair of silk stockings for 69 cents, an ice cream sundae for a nickel, and a brand new Chevrolet automobile for $635. Across the border, many Mexicans could barely scratch out a living. Mexico's industries and transportation systems lay in ruins.
There was a great struggle throughout the country over who would own the land. There were many different needs for revolt and reform.
The most successful revolutionary generals, including Pancho Villa, were those who could continue to find ways to rearm and resupply their armies.
Pancho Villa stands out primarily because of all the leaders of the Mexican Revolution, he was one of the few who were one of the people. So many of the leaders of the revolution were actually members of the aristocracy.
Villa was successful at both maintaining his rebel troops and defeating the well-trained federal forces. On May 25, 1911, with rebels closing in, President Diaz resigned his office and fled to Europe. But the vanquished dictator's exile from Mexico only heralded in a new series of revolts, this time with revolutionary leaders turning against each other to seize power for themselves. In 1912, Pancho Villa was arrested and charged with refusing to obey the orders of his commanding officer in the Revolutionary Army. Villa was sentenced to death by firing squad.
He was before a firing squad, and they had put the bandana on his eyes, and they were ready to shoot him. And at the last minute, Francisco Madero, who was the president of Mexico at the time, and very loyal to Villa, as Villa was loyal to him, intervened and put an end to it. And legend was built, and it grew, and it grew, you know, out of these type of stories.
Villa had many close calls with death. And there were a growing number of political rivals who would be happy to see him dead.
Villa was blamed for every crime anyone ever committed. They'd always say, Villa did it, Villa did it. It was Villa, but they were lies. Villa was sometimes not even aware of what all of his men were doing. Imagine 100,000 men under your command, and some of those men were reckless.
President Madero, in order to save Villa from all the accusations, sent him to prison in Mexico City. There, Villa befriended a legal clerk.
Through his friendship with this legal clerk, he basically was able to maneuver himself and get a disguise as a lawyer, and he basically just walked right out of the prison in lawyer's clothes, and nobody noticed.
He escaped from the jail, and he went to El Paso.
Pancho Villa, once again a fugitive, fled to the United States. But after only a month, word came that President Madero had been assassinated by political rivals in Mexico City. Villa openly wept at the news of the assassination of his old friend. He returned to Mexico, vowing to avenge Madero's death.
With the assassination of Francisco Madero, the Mexican Revolution begins again, and Villa, who is in El Paso, probably doesn't have but 30 people he can call on, and yet he crosses a river, and he hasn't gone but a mile, and he's got 100 people, and he's gone 10 miles, and there is 1,000, and he has gone 50 miles, and there is 15 or 20,000 men, and they are following him, and it is Villa's army that is actually cutting through the core of Mexico, knocking flat one city right after another, and it is Villa who is leading the army.
Villa marched through the state of Chihuahua and into the capital city.
He came to Chihuahua on December 8, 1913, and he took the city. And next day, he was nominated governor of the state.
Pancho Villa, the one-time petty outlaw who had become a general in the Revolutionary Army, had moved into the governor's palace, the same place from where warrants for his arrest had once been issued. Here, Villa discovered the power of the pen and his own executive orders.
He confiscated all the lands of the landlords of the states. He confiscated all the enterprises, all the banks, factories, everything.
He
lowered the price of meat and of bread so that all the people could eat well.
Villa even had his own money printed, which was accepted in transactions with American companies. Because during this period, most political experts in the United States believed it was only a matter of time before Pancho Villa would become president of Mexico. But the winds of war were still heating up across Mexico's landscapes, and Pancho Villa was about to be swept off the governor's chair and back into the middle of the battlefield, with enemies on both sides of the border. Between 1913 and 1914, Villa's Revolutionary Army won major battles as far north as Juarez and as far south as Zacatecas.
Pancho Villa was truly the last of the warlords. The William Wallaces, the Alexander the Greats, who would be on their horse and would charge in this blitzkrieg fashion and just wipe people out. And these were the warlords who won warfare through sheer courage. And that was Pancho Villa's legend.
Pancho Villa discovered that railroad trains could transport an army and supplies quickly from one battlefield to the next. Villa ordered his soldiers to ride on top of the railroad cars and the horses inside. Good war ponies were much harder to find than soldiers. A common practice for rebel generals at the time was to bury stashes of money and arms that could easily be uncovered between battles. Rumors continually circulated that Pancho Villa's buried treasure was scattered throughout the Mexican landscape.
Villa himself told some people that he had buried a large treasure in a cave outside of Chihuahua. He used that hidden treasure from time to time because he didn't have much trust in banks.
In December 1914, Villa's triumphant army marched south all the way to the national capital at Mexico City. In fact, Villa made it all the way into the presidential palace.
One of the great stories of the revolution is when Pancho Villa actually took Mexico City, and it became the interim president, if you will, along with Emiliano Zapata, who was the same type of warlord, but in the South. And here were the two peasant generals sitting there on the, there's a picture, and they're sitting there on the presidential throne, and they're laughing, saying, "Look at us, the peasants, and we've taken over. And what do you think of that?" And it's a very famous picture.
Villa and Zapata left Mexico City with rival troops close on their heels. During this period of the revolution, there were many victories and defeats. There were also stories of war atrocities, with Pancho Villa often at the center.
He comes through this little town in Sonora, and Villa now turns around, occupies the town, and says that come sunrise he is shooting every man, woman, and child resident in that community. And the priest goes to see Villa. In fact, twice he comes to Villa and begs Villa not to do this bit of savagery, and Villa says, "If you come to me one more time, I'm going to kill you." The priest came to him one more time. Villa killed the priest, and the next morning his soldiers executed something like 70, 80 men there in the village square.
During the revolution, Villa did not believe he was committing crimes. He simply thought he was handing out his own form of justice.
What is certain is that Villa's story is shrouded in the chaos of war. And his was a time in history when technology drastically changed warfare. Artillery, armored vehicles, rapid-fire machine guns all changed the balance of military power, usually in favor of the side with better financial backing. But it was an ingeniously simple invention that helped reverse Pancho Villa's fortunes on the battlefield. Barbed wire. It was the perfect way to stop massive cavalry charges. One of Villa's primary adversaries, Alvaro Obregón, capitalized on Villa's weakness for depending on horses.
The horses run into the barbed wire and suddenly you have carnage. He sets up machine guns and they literally chop the cavalry to pieces.
General Obregón defeated Villa in major battles at Querétaro, Celaya, and León. Villa lost thousands of men in a series of routs.
He went to attack Agua Prieta. He was defeated and he came back to, he was defeated in Sonora and he came back to Chihuahua completely defeated and went to the mountains, to San Andres, and went back to the guerrilla fighting.
With the Mexican Revolution still raging, World War I broke out in Europe in 1914. Even though Pancho Villa's might had been greatly diminished, American authorities were worried about sending troops overseas when large numbers of armed Mexican rebels were just across the border. Villa had sworn to oust foreign influences in his country, and American citizens held vast investments in Mexico, in land, cattle, gold mines, and in Mexico's lucrative oil fields. In April of 1914, the U.S. went as far as to occupy the Mexican port of Veracruz and its nearby oil refineries. But after 6 months of heated international protests, the United States withdrew. In October of 1915, even though several Mexican rebel forces were still at war with each other, the United States recognized Venustiano Carranza as the official head of the Mexican government.
Los Estados Unidos darían el reconocimiento de facto al gobierno.
The United States recognized the de facto government of Carranza instead of Villa. The Americans allowed Carranza's troops to cross through American territory to fight against Villa's army.
American officials had looked the other way as Carranza's troops used American railroads to circle through U.S. soil and then attack Villa's men back in Mexico. Villa was furious. In his mind, it meant the United States had just declared war against him.
Well, I was approaching 4 years old. Of course, the sentries were the first ones who were killed, so there was really nothing to warn the town.
March 9th, 1916, Pancho Villa attacked the U.S. border town of Columbus, New Mexico, while most of its residents were still asleep.
My great-grandfather was one of the civilians that was killed in that raid.
"4:11 in the morning. One of the first bullets fired hit a clock and froze the exact moment for history.
My mother said that they were awakened by bullets hitting the pipes, and stove pipes in the old-fashioned way of heating, of course, with little stoves.
I think it was vengeance. And Villa needed arms, he needed food, he needed supplies.
Pancho Villa had done the unthinkable. For the first time since the British sacked Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812, a foreign army had invaded U.S. soil.
They had no warning. My grandmother, all of them were in their robes and nightgowns.
The Villistas had a passion for looting. And they looted every store on Broadway Street, which is the main street of the village at that time.
And they yanked the lockets off of my grandmother's neck and the rings off of my mother's fingers.
The American soldiers at nearby Camp Furlong joined the battle, still under the cover of darkness.
One of the big mistakes that the Villistas made was when they started the fire at the mercantile store. And then it caught the hotel on fire and it lit up the whole area so that the soldiers could see the Villistas to shoot them.
At daybreak, survivors began to count the dead. One of the first to die, James T. Dean, a farmer from Iowa who had moved his family to the border town to start a new life. He took his final steps, trying to put out a fire at the town store.
Well, it was as he was going down Main Street, he got to Broadway, which is the main four corners of town, and that is as far as he got. That's where his body was found, with 17 bullet holes in him.
19 Americans died that day. Their names are memorialized on 2 small plaques in town. 8 soldiers are listed and only 10 civilians. One name is missing because one of the casualties had not yet been born.
The only woman that was killed was Bessie James, and she was with child. And this, today's standards, that would be a life. In those days, they did not count that child as a life.
Villa's raiders got away with supplies, horses, and munitions, but they paid a huge price in lost lives. Villa had between 500 and 900 men when he attacked. At least 200 of them were killed or captured.
The Mexicans suffered terribly, but what they did not realize was that they were forming a raid against a small garrison of American regular army troops that were equipped with machine guns.
The raid was over in less than 3 hours. But memories of what happened have lasted a lifetime.
I've lived with it practically every day of my life. We stood looking at the ruins of the hotel. It was still smoldering. I guess it was mattresses and things. And they were crying, and my grandmother, they all put their arms around one another. And, you know, to a child, I was very struck with, oh, why are they all crying? You know, my grandmother, whom I dearly loved. And where was the hotel? Why were all these horses dead and in the street? I mean, this is incomprehensible to a 4-year-old.
News of the raid sent shockwaves throughout the United States, all the way to President Woodrow Wilson in the White House.
As soon as the United States was attacked by a foreign country, which was Mexico, even though it was a revolutionary, President Wilson had the power, under emergency power, to call up state militias on an international incident, which that was.
A reward of $5,000 was immediately issued for Francisco Pancho Villa, alive or dead. But the American government was also calling out its big guns.
El cual daban $50,000.
I heard that after the raid, some Americans offered $50,000 for Villa's head, delivered from here back to the United States.
American newspapers, which once had printed sympathetic stories about the peasant revolutionary, were now calling for his arrest.
Now, as far as the Americans are concerned, he is simply a butcher, and he needs to be caught and he needs to be punished.
An American court even indicted Villa for the raid. And only 7 days after the raid on Columbus, General John Pershing led 6,600 American soldiers across the border in pursuit of Villa. Officially named the Punitive Expedition, it was significant for many reasons. It was the first time the United States used airplanes in combat. The first time the U.S. cavalry used mechanized vehicles, including trucks and motorcycles, in a military assault. Ironically, they had to use mules and horse-drawn wagons to carry the fuel for their new war machines.
It's the last time an American soldier went into combat without a helmet. It's the last time an American soldier went into combat without a gas mask.
Pershing's army, which reportedly swelled to as many as 11,000 at times, ventured more than 500 miles into Mexico.
The American punitive expedition, in my judgment, came about primarily because this was the American way of saying to Mexico, if you can't control your own borders, we're going to control them for you.
American newspapers closely watched Pershing's advance. There were even reports, which later proved false, that Villa had been captured or killed. For 11 months, the Americans found only the dust left by Pancho Villa's fleeing horses. At this same time, Villa was also a fugitive from Mexican federal troops.
He eluded the formal armies of two countries and did it at will, which was very embarrassing to both sides.
By the summer of 1916, Pancho Villa was on the run from Pershing's American army and from Mexican federal troops.
Everything was against him. The American government, the Mexican government, General Pershing and Mexican army, all the generals trying to kill him, and nobody could.
General Pershing's army ventured as far south as the city of Parral in search of Villa, who easily hid in the rough terrain he knew so well.
From Villa's hiding places, he'd laugh at the Americans searching for him. He'd say, they're looking for the coyote, and the coyote is right behind them.
America's incursion into Mexico in search of the outlaw Pancho Villa lasted 11 months and cost an estimated $140 million. On a remote hacienda deep in Mexican territory, there are haunting reminders of this footnote in American history. 2 tombstones marking the gravesites of fallen U.S. soldiers located on a small patch of land next to the hacienda's own private cemetery. During the punitive expedition, more than a dozen American soldiers lost their lives in skirmishes with Mexican soldiers. On February 5th, 1917, Pershing's army crossed the border back into the United States, never having caught as much as a glimpse of Pancho Villa. 2 months after the return of Pershing's army from Mexico, the United States declared war on Germany. Meanwhile, in Mexico, fierce fighting continued between rival revolutionary forces until 1920. A decade after it began, the price for peace would be the lives of 1.5 million Mexicans. That's almost twice the number of fatalities suffered in the American Civil War. Pancho Villa was the last of the original revolutionary generals who had vowed to bring democracy to Mexico. In the summer of 1920, the Mexican federal government finally found a way to get Pancho Villa to lay down his arms.
I think we're always fascinated by revolutionaries, by people who think different, who do different things, who aspire to great deeds.
Villa stopped fighting in exchange for several huge haciendas, 500,000 pesos in gold, and his own hand-picked personal bodyguards.
He asked for a 50-man escort to protect his life. He was permitted. These soldiers were going to be paid by the Mexican government.
Ironically, Pancho Villa became what he had fought against most of his life, a wealthy hacienda owner. By 1923, Pancho Villa, the retired general, lived at one of his haciendas with 3 of his wives and many of his children.
Recuerdo que mi padre contaba.
I remember my father telling stories about how much General Villa loved to swim. The river Florida passed near the hacienda at Canutillo, and he would take the children there to swim.
As fierce a warrior as he was, Villa had a particularly tender spot in his heart for the poor children.
How are you, boys? He would tell us. He'd pat us on the head. He'd take coins out of his saddlebag and give each of us one. 20 centavos for a child then was a great deal of money. You could buy 5 large candies, enough for the entire week.
But a decade of bitter civil war had created many foes.
You can't kill that many people without having a lot of people wishing you dead. And so as a result, he always traveled with bodyguards.
July 23rd, 1923, Pancho Villa drives down this street in the city of Parral. As Villa's car slows down, 8 gunmen opened fire. The car crashes into a tree at the end of the street. Villa's body has 16 bullet holes.
We were little boys, and being curious, we walked up to the car and put our fingers in the holes made by the impact of the bullets.
Both a hero and an outlaw, the warlord who survived countless battles ended his life on a quiet street while driving home to his hacienda. Francisco Pancho Villa's life helped define the spirit of his country's struggle for freedom.
Pancho Villa's place in history is really a paradox, like Pancho Villa. On one end, he's a revolutionary idealist who's very firm to his beliefs and believed in things like public education, public health, good government. And on the other end, he was a vicious, mean-spirited, cruel revolutionary who would do anything to win.
His legend is a complex mosaic of folklore and fact, which covers the atrocities of war and the indomitable human spirit to overthrow oppressive, unjust governments.
Cuántos jilgueros y sensontles veo pasar, pero qué tristes cantan esas avecillas. Van a Chihuahua a llorar sobre Parral, donde descansa el general Francisco Villa. Lloran al ver aquella tumba, donde descansa para siempre el general. Sin el clavel, sin flor ninguna, solo hojas secas la astral del Andeval. En el Parral descansa Villa, en el regazo del lugar que tanto amó. Que viva mi general Francisco Villa.